Let's bring in our guests now. In Washington, D.C., we have William Courtney. He's a former U.S. ambassador and White House advisor on Russian and Eastern European affairs. In London, former Kremlin advisor Alexander Nekrasov. And also in London, Ian Bond. He's a former British diplomat who worked both in NATO and in Moscow and is now Director of Foreign Policy at the Center for European Reform. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Alexander Nekrasov, let me start with you. Is Russia a danger to the Baltics and Eastern Europe?
Well, of course not, because Russia would never attack any country which is a member of NATO. It's a very simple logic. If you attack one NATO country, all the rest go against you. So this is a made-up allegation. This suits the Western countries because they have built up their troops on the borders with Russia. They are posing the greatest danger. And to be honest with you, after what happened in Ukraine, where the government was overthrown with the help, finances, and support of the West, and then the West accused Russia of aggression and taking over the East Ukraine and Crimea, that is absolutely absurd. You can't lie to your own people, forgetting the most recent history. You can't rewrite history like that. And don't forget another thing. Russia disbanded the Warsaw Pact in good faith, and the West tricked Russia, and NATO stayed on. And not only stayed on, it broke its promise that NATO would move eastwards, and it moved eastwards.
Right, okay. So Ian Bond, that's one side of the story. That's the Russian narrative. NATO's the one doing the encroaching. NATO's the one doing the provoking, not Russia. Do you agree with any of that?
Well, not surprisingly, no, I don't. I mean, first of all, if one looks at the current situation, Russia has about 400,000 troops in its western military district. That's the part of Russia which faces the Baltic states and Poland and that area. And NATO has, if you include the forces of the Baltic states themselves, as well as NATO's reinforcements, something of the order of 15,000. So I think, you know, to say that NATO's 15,000 troops are a threat to Russia's 400,000 would really be rather surprising. And in terms of the history, I'm afraid what Alexander Nekrasov has said is complete nonsense. I mean, the fact is that Russia annexed Crimea. That's the first seizure of territory from another country in Europe that has taken place since the Second World War. And its forces are deployed in eastern Ukraine. And I'm afraid the problem is that Russian troops in eastern Ukraine keep posting on Russian social media networks. So it's pretty easy to see when they have moved from their bases in Russia to places in eastern Ukraine. So it simply doesn't carry any credibility to suggest that NATO's making this stuff up.
Okay, I'm going to give you a right of reply, Mr. Nekrasov. You're going to get an opportunity to reply to that. But let me bring in Ambassador Courtney for the moment. In general, the Latvians, the Estonians, the Lithuanians, and even the likes of the Norwegians, do they have cause for concern? Is there good reason for why they're so nervous about Russia and asking the West for more help?
Yes. In the past, it has not been possible to predict Russian military actions. For example, prior to 2014, no one in the West really expected Russia to seize and annex Crimea, much less to invade eastern Ukraine and carry out a war which is still being fought. The Russian mercenaries and pro-Russian separatists there are still fighting and killing Ukrainians. The Russians have established a new military command for the Arctic and also one for the Black Sea. So from the standpoint of the Baltics, Poland, Norway, Scandinavia, for them, it's not easy to predict what Russia's next move is going to be. So they do have genuine perceptions that the threat is increasing.
Alexander Nekrasov, Russia's unpredictable, and given the body of evidence over the recent years, these countries have cause for concern because they don't want to be swallowed up. Isn't that fair?
Well, it's not fair, simply because if anyone is the aggressor, it's usually the Americans and the British are helping them to accuse Russia when the West has been invading other countries openly or quietly is just absurd. And notice that both speakers did not mention the coup that happened in Ukraine and overturned a legitimate democratic regime. Notice that they don't talk about it. They cut this piece of history off and start talking what happened afterwards. But afterwards was caused by that coup that was funded and organized by the West. You can't change history like that and expect that people who know history will fall for that cheap propaganda. This is cheap propaganda. This is not proper debate. This is just, you know, talking about events the way you want them to be seen and not the way the world sees this event. So no, I don't buy these arguments at all.
Okay, Ian Bond, Western meddling, particularly from Mr. Nekrasov's perspective with regards Mr. Yanukovych and Ukraine. At the root cause of everything, are you ignoring half of the story, Ian?
Certainly not. I mean, the reason that I didn't mention the coup is partly for the sense of brevity and partly because there wasn't a coup. If one wants to rewrite history, then the Russian narrative that there was a coup is a pretty good example. We actually had an agreement brokered by the French, German, Polish foreign ministers with a representative of the Russian president and President Yanukovych. The Russians refused to sign that agreement at the last minute, and Yanukovych fled from Kiev before the agreement could be implemented. That's not a coup, that's a president running out on his own country. And in those circumstances, I think the Ukrainians have done very well to rebuild a state and a democratic system in the intervening years while under constant attack from Moscow.
Okay, and I just want to park that off now, for now, if you all don't mind, because I'll put Ukraine away for the moment and look at some of the tensions now. I want to ask you, William Courtney, is it necessary, is it wise for NATO and its allies to conduct all of these drills in the Baltic Sea? There's a big one coming up in October, Trident Juncture, Sweden, Finland, NATO all together. Is it wise to antagonize Russia in this way and only make them sharpen their weapons for possible conflict because they feel you're on our border and you're messing with us?
For NATO forces to be able effectively to deter Russian aggression, it's necessary that they carry out training and exercises to show that they can work together to find whatever deficiencies there may be in the forces and repair those. So exercises are a critically important part of NATO activity. They are certainly important in the Baltic region. Sweden and Finland have seen increased concerns about Russian threats. Of course, Norway is asked to double the number of U.S. Marines there from 350 to 700. In the Black Sea, NATO, with some basing on a rotational basis of air forces in Romania, is carrying out additional activities to try to deter Russian aggression in that theater as well. So exercises and training are important.
Okay, so Mr. Nekrasov, they want Western help because they're frightened. They have an existential threat when it comes to Russia.
Well, it's all provocations. Now, let me tell you something. All these war games by NATO are intended as a provocation and baiting Russia. Now, let me tell your two guests. The next world war will be nuclear. So you can practice all your marine operations, all your wonderful ships and so on. It is meaningless. This will be a nuke war. So please remember that when you start provoking Russia and doing the silly war games all over the place. And don't forget also that the country that has the most military bases abroad is America, all over the world. Russia has 1, 2, 3 bases. That is it. So please don't start telling that Russia is the aggressor when you've covered the whole world with bases, when your military budget is more than the next 7 countries after you, and you are telling that Russia is the aggressor. You know, you sound childish, and you sound uninformed as well, because you don't understand what the modern conflict is all about, military war.
Okay,
so you don't understand. You talk about silly things like war games.
Okay, talk about silly things. I mean, Ian Bond, we have Mr. Mr. Nekrasov saying, be careful, the next war will be nuclear, so these war games will almost be meaningless in some ways when it comes to nuclear bombs. Let me allow you to address that, but also fold in something to think about here. The former Estonian president recently saying that Russia would lose St. Petersburg if it dared to attack the region. Are we finding kind of reckless talk on both sides at the moment?
Well, I haven't seen where, I presume that's Thomas Hendrik Ilves. I hadn't seen
Yes.
where he had said that, but I can't believe that he meant that seriously. But in response to Alexander Nekrasov's point, I think it's extraordinarily irresponsible to start talking about nuclear war in these rather offhand terms. The fact is that both sides carry out military exercises because if you don't want to find yourself in a position where you feel you have no option but to resort to your nuclear deterrent, you need your conventional forces to be in good order. And you need to be able to demonstrate to people who you believe wish you ill that your conventional forces are in good order. Russia does that, we do that, China does that. Every power does that, and it would be extraordinary if they didn't. But to go from that to say we're going to have a world war and it's going to be a nuclear war and you should stop your silly war games, I find extraordinarily irresponsible.
Mr. Nekrasov, the fact that Russia wishes these countries ill is a valid reason for them to want to protect themselves.
Well, it's all made up. The Baltics, if you look at their history, they were always telling things that didn't really mean anything, didn't exist anything. Don't forget, these three Baltic states were fighting on the side of Hitler's armies. And so let's not forget all of these things as well. And all this rhetoric is meaningless. And I caution my colleagues that saying, oh, it's irresponsible to talk about nuclear war. This is exactly what's going to happen. And that is why it is so dangerous to provoke countries like Russia and like China as well, by the way, because the West is now provoking China as well over the islands. So you must understand, they have to be responsible themselves. They have to stop inventing all these fairy tales about somebody attacking the Baltics, for example, when everybody knows you do not attack a member of NATO because you have to deal with other NATO members. Clause 5. Don't you remember that?
Okay, so let me.
Which country would be
that's a good point.
to do this?
Okay, so William Courtney, all for one and one for all. An attack on one is an attack on all. Realistically speaking, if Russia was to attack a Baltic nation, do you think NATO would have the political will? Yes, it's on paper that they have to come to the defense of any NATO member. Do you think that they would have the political will to get involved in an all-out war with Russia?
Well, first, let me thank Mr. Nekrasov. Twice he has indicated how important NATO is as an alliance in terms of defending its own members. Appreciate that. Yes, a key reason why training and exercises are carried out is to show countries in NATO that participate that NATO is in fact committed to their defense. If NATO trains and exercises to protect its members, that's the most credible thing it can do to show its members that it will come to their defense in an extreme situation.
Ian Bond, we have Mr. Nekrasov saying that this is all nonsense, that is all made up, that the pretexts with regards Russia wishing any of these countries ill, that's all complete rubbish. Let me ask you from your perspective, what do you think they're thinking? If Russia wishes Eastern Europe ill, or the Baltic nations ill, or the Scandinavian nations ill, why are they doing that? Is it to create a dent in the NATO alliance?
Well, it's been a traditional aim, first of all, of the Soviet Union and subsequently of Russia to divide and weaken its opponents. But Russia still thinks very much in terms of spheres of influence. What the current Prime Minister, then President Medvedev, described as Russia's zone of privileged interest which basically meant that Russia felt that it has the right to tell countries on its borders what they can and can't do in a foreign policy sense. That's something which is, at least these days, alien to most European countries. They believe that countries like the Baltic states, or for that matter, like Ukraine or Georgia, have the right to determine for themselves what direction they should take in their foreign policy. But that, I think, is fundamentally why the Baltic states feel under threat. And one thing I have to challenge, Mr. Nekrasov claimed that they fought on the side of the Nazis. I mean, that is an outright lie. What actually happened was that first the Soviet Union invaded them in 1940, then Nazi Germany invaded them in 1941, and then the Soviet Union invaded them again in 1944 and occupied them until 1991. And with that sort of history, it's not entirely surprising that they feel that they face a bit of a threat from their eastern neighbour and want to find support from other democratic countries to stand up to any threats that might come from the east.
Okay, so Mr. Nekrasov, the fact that you felt the need to remind our viewers that these guys were Nazi collaborators when the story doesn't quite check out that way, doesn't it give all the more reason for them to fear you because they feel demonized by you?
No, these three republics were fascist states when the Soviet army moved in. And that is not me telling, that is the report of the Joint Committee of the House of Commons of the British Parliament after it visited three republics in 1938 and 39. So they were already fascist regimes that were playing games with everyone. So I'm telling the right story. The wrong story is told by the Western diplomats and historians. Unfortunately, this idea of turning Russia into an enemy is very simple. It is because America and its allies in NATO, Western allies, are the real aggressors. Look at Iraq, look at Libya, look at Syria, look at their interference everywhere else. Look at Yemen being destroyed completely to the ground with Western munitions while everybody looks the other way. And anywhere you look, everywhere you look, the Western meddling has destroyed whole nations, has created a migration crisis that has never been before seen in the history of the world.
Mr. Nekrasov,
and they are telling us that it's Russia.
Mr.
That's
Nekrasov,
unbelievable, unbelievable.
Okay, but you don't believe that Russian intervention in, for example, Syria hasn't also created a migrant crisis? That Russia's not also getting its hands very
Russian
dirty?
Intervention, excuse me, Russian intervention, first of all, it was invited by the government. Which
by
is
Bashar al-Assad,
by the
who's
UN.
responsible for the deaths of about 400,000 Syrians.
Excuse me, but he is accepted by the UN. And what are the Americans, the French, and the British are doing there? Nobody knows, but nobody called them there, you see? But they are meddle in every country, and every time they meddle, there is a serious problem. And that is why I can't understand this language. You know, you create a problem, and then you find and try to blame somebody for that problem. America is the biggest aggressor in this century. To claim that Russia is a danger. Russia has lost influence in all of the neighboring countries because of interference from the West. To say that it's the aggressor, it's a lie. It's a lie. It's just changing not just the course of history, it's changing yesterday's events to suit these agendas.
Okay.
And I can't really understand how a former diplomat and an advisor to the White House can simply, mix things up and present a sort of a scenario which suits them.
Okay.
It's unbelievable.
Okay. Ambassador Courtney, we've got about 30 seconds left on this segment. Final response from you, sir.
The West has an interest in Russia's being at peace with its neighbors. The West has given strong support to the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of all states of the former Soviet Union. Russian aggression in Georgia in 2008, in Ukraine beginning in 2014, has posed a challenge to European security arrangements that are unlike anything that has happened before since the end of World War II. There are mechanisms such as the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe where these issues can be discussed, but until the Russians make a decision to pull out of eastern Ukraine and end the war there, the West is going to remain pretty united in sanctions and opposition to Russian aggression in Ukraine.
Mr. Nekrasov, the point that the other two men seem to be making here is that Russia doesn't like the fact that the Lithuanians, the Estonians, and others want to decide their own foreign policy. They want to decide who they want to ally with or align with. So if they want to be pro-Western, that automatically means Russia will be antagonistic with them. That's the truth, isn't it?
No, it's not the truth, simply because, first of all, let me be blunt about this. The free republics, the Baltics, they are insignificant players in Europe. Nobody really cares what's happening there. Their economies are collapsing. They thought they will join the EU and be provided with finances, but the Russian tourists have stopped going there and they're basically falling apart. You must understand, the economy of the West is crumbling. It's falling apart. Their interest rates are at zero level, which means this is a crisis. They're hiding this crisis with false statistics and with lies, with blaming other countries
sorry to
for
interrupt you,
aggression.
but Estonia seems to be a pretty solid economy. It seems to be, compact little country, but doing really well.
No, all the free republics, I know many people from them. They're all in the West now. They said it's impossible to live there. The prices are too high, corruption is unbelievably bad.
But it sounds like you're talking about Russia.
No, I'm talking to people from these free republics. And they tell me the situation on the ground is terrible. And they're trying to leave, they're running away from it. So if these countries are losing their population, why is that they're saying, why do you think they're saying they're in danger?
Okay.
Because they have to hide that fact.
Okay, Ian Bond, does any of that sound appealing to you?
That is just such a joke. I mean, Riga is flourishing, and it's flourishing in part because of the number of Russians who choose to put their money there, sometimes their families there, to buy apartments in the city or houses at the seaside outside Riga. And they're doing that because they think that they want to have somewhere that they can get away to when the situation in Russia gets too much for them. The fact is that the economies of the three Baltic states suffered, yes, quite badly during the economic crisis, as indeed pretty much everybody's economy did. But they've been growing pretty healthily and are still growing pretty healthily at the moment. It is quite remarkable how many members even of the elite and those who surround President Putin find it convenient to spend part of their summer in the seaside resort of Yurmala just outside Riga. Right. So it's complete nonsense to talk about collapsing economies and people running away.
Let me take a slight twist here, William Courtney, and look at the Commander-in-Chief in the White House. He's not too keen on NATO. He keeps on talking about NATO paying their fair share, and Trump is not necessarily NATO's biggest fan. Is that going to have an impact on NATO's collective security, and is that going to have an impact on whether Russia can be curbed if it's trying to extend its influence in Eastern Europe?
It may have some impact. It's important, however, to realize that U.S. foreign policy in general and U.S. policy toward Russia in particular are shaped by policies of the U.S. Congress or views of the U.S. Congress. U.S. allies have a significant influence in Washington, and the U.S. president. So thus far, what we have seen is that since President Trump came to office, U.S. sanctions on Russia have been toughened. The United States is spending even more money on the European Deterrence Initiative, that is supporting rotational U.S. and NATO troops in the Baltics, Poland, and other parts of the world. So U.S. policy, it reflects a bipartisan consensus in the United States that Russia's aggression really deserves to be met with increasing costs to that aggression.
Yeah, there seems to have been a consistency with the U.S. policy. And what's interesting is that that's at odds with the idea that some in the U.S. have, that Russia put Trump in the White House. But that's another discussion altogether. Maybe we can have it another time. But William Courtney, Alexander Nekrasov, and Ian Bond, I thank you all for joining us on the Newsmakers.